The radio studio smelled of dust and old coffee, its walls lined with tattered felt, blocking out everything but the hum of the lamps and the faint sound of the sea outside. Alex Gray sat in his chair, his fingers fiddling with the edge of his headphones, his eyes tired and red as he watched the flickering screen tick away the seconds of the broadcast. The clock on the wall read 2:47 a.m. The time Grapefruit fell asleep in the fog, and only his voice, hoarse and low, cut through the silence for those who could not sleep. "Good night, Grapefruit," he said into the microphone, his words like stones dropped into dark water. "This is Night Surf, and I'm your Alex Gray. It's the anniversary of an old case. 20 years ago, Lili Rain, 12, blonde hair, smile like the morning light, disappeared. The police said an accident, maybe a runaway. But Grapefruit doesn't forget, does he?" He paused, his fingers tightening around his mug, the coffee in it long since gone cold, like the memories he was trying to erase. Lili Rain. He wrote an article about her in 2005 when he was still a journalist and not a shadow speaking into the void. He dug deeper than the police then, but all he found was rumors. The girl had drowned, run away, gotten lost in the woods. The case was closed, the archives gathered dust, and he left the newspaper when his questions began to irritate those who paid for silence. Now her name had come up by accident, like a piece of shipwreck thrown up by the waves, and he didn't know why he had decided to mention her on air. The phone on the console blinked, the line came alive. Alex pressed the button, his eyebrows raised. Calls were rare at this time of year. "I'm listening," he said, his voice soft, as if he were talking to a friend. "Who's on the line?" The silence answered him, but it was not empty. There was a rustle in it, distant, like the breath of wind. Then a voice rang out, high, childlike but calm, as if its owner knew she would be heard. "It's Lili," she said. "Lili Rain." Alex froze, his fingers gripping his earphones, his heart pounding like a drum in an empty room. He opened his mouth, but the words were caught like a fish in a net. "Lili?" he asked, his voice shaking like a string about to snap. "Is this a joke?" The girl didn't answer right away, her breathing audible on the airwaves, light but uneven. "I can't talk for long," she said, her tone oddly even, as if she were reading a text. "He's coming." There was noise in the background, waves crashing against rocks, and a ringing sound, thin as wind chimes, hanging in the wind. The broadcast ended. The light on the console went out, the screen flickered, and a silence as thick as the fog outside filled the studio. Alex ripped off his headphones, his hands shaking as he pressed the callback button, but the line was dead. The number didn't exist. He stood up, his steps quick, as if he could catch up with the voice that had disappeared into the night. On the chat screen, listeners wrote, "Who was that?" "It's Lili. I heard her voice." "Alex, are you okay?" He didn't answer, his eyes glued to the tape recorder that was recording the broadcast. He rewound the tape, his fingers sliding over the buttons like wet glass. Lili's voice came again, clear but slightly trembling, as if she were standing on the edge of something immense. "I can't talk for long. He's coming." The sound of waves, the ringing of bells, then silence. Alex listened, his breath ragged, like fabric torn by claws. He knew that voice, not from memory, but from an old tape he'd listened to while researching the article. An interview with Lili, recorded a week before she disappeared. The same timbre, the same intonations, as if time hadn't touched her. He slumped into a chair, his hands clutching his head as if he could squeeze the sound out of it. It was a joke, a prank, an attempt to revive a forgotten case. But why on the anniversary? Why at 2:47, the exact time Lili had gone missing? He pulled out an old notebook, its pages crumpled like his life, and found a note. Lili Rain, age 12, missing March 17, 2005, 2:47 a.m., docks. He underlined the date, his pencil breaking, leaving a black streak like a scar. The studio seemed smaller, its walls compressed like lungs deprived of air. He stood and went to the window, his fingers brushing the cold glass. Fog swept over Grapefruit, its lights flickering like stars dying in the night. He knew he had to check the footage, find Lili's mother, Evelyn, or the old detective who had worked the case. But fear, thin as a thread, pulled him back. Lili's voice was more than a sound. It was a key, opening a door that might hold nothing or everything. He returned to the console, his fingers twirling the music to fill the airwaves. But his mind was elsewhere. He knew that this call was not the end, but the beginning, and that Grapefruit, sleeping beneath the fog, held secrets that did not want to be found. He looked at the microphone, his reflection pale as a ghost, and whispered, not to the airwaves but to himself, "Who are you, Lili?" The fog over Grapefruit was so thick that Alex Gray's headlights barely pierced it, picking up patches of asphalt and wet branches that clung to the road like fingers. He drove toward Lili Rain's house, his hands gripping the wheel, a recording playing in his head. Lili's voice, her words, cold and clear. "I can't talk much longer. He's coming." The ether cassette lay on the passenger seat, its plastic gleaming, like an eye watching him. He hadn't slept since that night, his eyelids heavy as lead, but his mind sharp as a knife cutting through the darkness. Evelyn's house sat on the edge of a cliff, its wooden walls darkened by salt and time, listing like a ship about to sink. The windows were boarded up, but light filtered through the cracks, weak as the breath of a dying man. Alex stopped the car, its engine dying with a hoarse sigh, and silence fell upon him, broken only by the distant roar of the waves and the creak of the gate swinging in the wind. He took out his recorder, his fingers shaking as he pressed record, and stepped toward the door, his boots squelching in the wet grass. He knocked, his fist thumping on the wood, but there was no answer. He knocked again, harder, and the door swung open, its hinges groaning as if the house didn't want him inside. "Evelyn!" he called, his voice hoarse as a desert whisper. "It's Alex Gray on the radio. I need to talk." Silence was the answer. But then there were footsteps, slow, as if their owner was afraid to disturb the silence. The door opened wider, and Evelyn appeared in the doorway, her face paper white, her eyes blank and red, staring through him as if he were a ghost. "You came because of her," she said, her voice dry as leaves falling onto a grave. She didn't ask, didn't sound surprised, just turned and walked into the house, leaving the door open. Alex followed, his nostrils filled with the smell of damp old furniture, and something else, sweet like wilted flowers. The living room was piled high with boxes, their edges crumpled, as if someone had tried to hide the past and failed. There was a picture of Lili on the wall, blonde hair smiling, bells around her neck, and Alex felt his heart tighten as if someone had tightened a noose. "I heard her," he said, his words as careful as steps on thin ice. On the air, the day before yesterday, she called herself Lili. Evelyn froze, her hands shaking on the kettle, and the water splashed onto the floor like tears. "You're wrong," she said, her voice sharp but cracked. "My girl is gone. 20 years ago." She turned, her eyes meeting his, and there was pain in them, as old as the sea outside. Alex pulled out the tape, his fingers clutching it like a talisman. "It's her voice," he said, his tone firm, but inside he was shaking like a leaf in the wind. "I compared it to an interview she gave at school. It's her." Evelyn shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't answer. She walked over to the dresser, her movement slow, as if she were carrying an impossible load, and pulled out an old box, its lid covered in dust like a shroud. "A week ago," she said, her voice low, like a whisper from underground, "I found this on the porch." She opened the box, and Alex saw a note, a piece of paper folded in half, the letters jagged. "You forgot." He took it, his fingers feeling the coldness of the paper, as if it had been sitting in water. "I called the police," Evelyn continued, her eyes glued to the note. "But when they got there, she was gone, right from the house." Alex looked at her, his mind racing like a caged animal. "Someone knew I'd mentioned Lili on the air," he said, his voice low as the roar of the sea. "Someone wanted me to hear her." Evelyn turned to the photograph, her fingers brushing the glass as if she could touch her daughter. "She loved bells," she said, her voice soft but pained. "Wore them around her neck, like a talisman. When she went missing, they were never found." Alex felt a chill run down his spine, his memory alive. The sound of bells on the airwaves, thin but clear as Lili's voice. He wanted to ask, but the words stuck like bones in his throat. He walked out of the house, his steps heavy, as if he carried all of Evelyn's pain with him. It started to rain, the drops hitting his face like needles, but he didn't notice. In the car, he turned on the recorder, his voice shaking as he wrote down. "A note. Bells. Someone's playing with me, but..." "Why?" He looked at the photo of Lili that Evelyn had given him, her smile like a light that was gone. He knew he had to find answers, but every step was like a leap into an abyss where the truth could be more frightening than the silence. The wind whipped across Grapefruit, carrying the smell of salt and rust, clinging to the old cranes on the docks that creaked like bones, long since stripped of their flesh. Alex Gray walked along the wooden planks, his coat flapping like a flag surrendering to the storm, the lantern in his hand shaking, picking out tattered planks and shadows from the fog that seemed alive. He stopped at the edge of the dock where Lili Rain had last been seen 20 years ago, and looked out to sea, the waves pounding the rocks like a heart that refused to stop. In his pocket was a photograph of Lili, her smile a light that had long been gone. He had come here after meeting Evelyn, her words, "You forgot," and the ringing of the bells on the airwaves haunting him. He knew the answers were out there, in this abandoned corner of Grapefruit, where time stood still, like a watch drowned in water. But first he had to find Garrett Cole, the retired detective who had been on Lili's case until he was forced out. Alex pulled out his notebook, its pages damp, but the address to Garrett's trailer was still legible, scrawled in a hasty hand, as if he were afraid to change his mind. The trailer sat in a vacant lot behind the docks, its metal sides scarred with rust, its windows hung with old sheets soaked with damp. Alex knocked, his fist denting the thin door, and silence answered, broken only by the clink of empty bottles rolling across the floor inside. "Garrett," he called, his voice rough as pebbles underfoot. "This is Alex Gray on the radio. I need to talk to Lili Rain." The door opened slightly, and Garrett's face appeared in the crack, lined, eyes cloudy as puddle water, the smell of whiskey escaping. "You shouldn't have come," Garrett said, his voice like the crackle of an old radio about to go silent. "Case closed, go home." He tried to close the door, but Alex dug his toe in, his boot scraping against the metal. "I heard her," he said, the words like a blow but also a plea. "On the air. She called herself Lili. This is no joke." Garrett froze, his hand shaking on the door, and stepped back, letting Alex in. Inside, the trailer was cramped as a coffin, piled high with boxes and old newspapers and bottles whose labels had long since faded. On the table was a folder, its edges crumpled, its cover written in faded letters. Rain, Lili, 2005. Garrett slumped in a chair, his fingers wrapped around the bottle, but he didn't drink, just looked at it like it was an old friend. "You're not the first to hear something weird," he said, his voice low as the roar of the sea. "There were witnesses back in 2005, fishermen, movers. They said they heard a crying sound like a baby coming from the radio on 96.8 FM. The night she went missing." Alex felt a chill run down his spine, his fingers tightening around the recorder in his pocket. "Why didn't they put that in the report?" he asked, his voice firm, but inside it shaking like a leaf in the wind. "You hid it?" Garrett chuckled, his laugh bitter as the taste of ash. "Not me," he said, his eyes glittering as if he could see beyond the trailer. "They forced me. They said it was crazy, that the witnesses were drunk. And then they dropped the case. I left after a month." He paused, his fingers tightening around the bottle as if it would keep him from falling. Alex pulled out a photograph of Lili, the bells around her neck glittering like stars in the night. "That's her," he said, his voice low like a whisper from the earth. "I heard her voice, and bells like these." Garrett looked at the photo, his face gray as the fog outside the window. "They didn't find them," he said, his words like stones falling into water. "No body, no bells, just her shoe on the docks." He stood, his steps unsteady, and pulled an old map of Grapefruit from a box, its edges torn like fabric ripped by claws. "That's where she was last seen," he said, pointing to a spot near the pier. But there was nothing there, just fog. Alex walked away, his footsteps echoing across the wasteland, the wind whipping his face. He walked back to the docks, his lantern flickering, illuminating rusty chains and the wreckage of boats long since claimed by the sea. He pulled out an old radio, its batteries dead, but he turned the dial anyway, tuning to 96.8 FM. The silence was absolute, but then there was a crackling sound, faint as a breath, and a voice. Her voice. "Alex, can you hear that?" He turned, his heart stopping, but there was only fog around him, thick and cold as the breath of death. The radio went silent, its dial darkened, and he was alone, with Lili's photograph in his hand, and the feeling that the truth he sought was closer than he was prepared to accept. He walked back to the car, his fingers writing in his notebook. 96.8 FM, crying from the radio. Someone knew. He knew he had to find Lili's journal, the one Garrett had mentioned, but every step felt like a leap into an abyss where a voice from the past might be a warning as well as a memory. The fog in Grapefruit had grown thicker, its grey threads clinging to the streetlights like a spider's web catching the light. Alex Gray stood outside Lili Rain's house, his coat wet from the rain, his face as pale as the paper he clutched in his pocket. It was a page from Lily's diary, found an hour ago behind the wallpaper in her room, where he had returned after talking to Garrett. The last entry, jagged and hastily written, burned in his memory. He said, "I was no longer needed, but now I hear them, calling me back." The words were like a splinter in his mind, and he couldn't pull them out. Evelyn's house creaked in the wind, its boards groaning as if the house were alive and suffering. Alex walked in without knocking, his boots leaving dirty marks on the floor, his throat tight as if he'd swallowed the sea. The living room was the same, the boxes, the dust, the photograph of Lily with the bells. But it seemed smaller now, as if the walls were closing in, squeezing out the air. Evelyn sat in a chair, her hands thin as branches, clutching an old shawl, her eyes empty as windows boarded up before a storm. "I found this," Alex said, his voice hoarse like the crackle of a radio tuned to a dead frequency. Lily's diary. She wrote about someone. Him. He pulled out the page, his fingers shaking, as if the paper might burn at his touch. Evelyn didn't look up, her lips moving, but no words came out, only a whisper, faint as a breath of wind. "You shouldn't have," she said at last, her voice an echo from the depths of a well. "She's gone. Leave her." But Alex had. Stepped closer, his shadow falling across her face like a stain. "She called me, Evelyn," he said, his words like blows, but there was pain in them. "I heard her, and others do, on 96.8 FM. Evelyn flinched, her shawl sliding to the floor like a snake's shed skin. "You don't understand," she whispered, her eyes shining as if tears were waiting to come. "It's not her. It's something else." Alex froze, his heart pounding like a drum calling to war. He wanted to ask, but the room suddenly rocked like the deck of a ship, and he grabbed the table, his fingers gripping the edge as if that would anchor him to reality. The clock on the wall stopped, its hands frozen at 2:47, and a silence as thick as oil filled the house. He stepped outside, his steps quick, as if he could outrun what he was seeing. Fog clung to Grapefruit, its streets empty, but every window held shadows, every sound a whisper. He pulled out his phone, its screen flickering with messages from listeners. "I heard her on 96.8 FM. She's calling you, Alex. Stop before it's too late." He turned the phone off, his fingers shaking, but the voices weren't gone. They were in his head, faint but insistent, like waves crashing on the shore. He stopped by an old lantern, its light flickering like a candle about to go out. In the distance, in the fog, a figure appeared, small in a light dress with bells ringing in the wind. "Lily?" he called, his voice weak, like a whisper from a dream. The figure turned, her face hidden in shadow, but her eyes, bright as stars, looked straight at him. He stepped forward, his hand outstretched, but the fog thickened, and she was gone, leaving only a ringing sound, thin and cold as ice. Alex walked back into the car, his breath ragged like fabric torn by claws. He turned on the radio, his hand shaking as he tuned to 96.8 FM. The silence was absolute, but then there was a crackle, and Lily's voice, soft but tired, came on. "You'll find me, Alex, but he's coming." The radio went silent, its dial went dark, and he was alone, with the journal in his hand and the feeling of reality cracking at the seams. He wrote in a notebook, his handwriting as uneven as a road in a storm. "Diary, Gaps. Voice on frequency. Someone is playing, but who? He knew he had to make a final broadcast to call Lili or whoever was behind her. But every step was like a leap into an abyss where the truth might not be salvation, but the end of everything he still held inside. The radio studio was cold as a grave, its felt-lined walls soaking up the heat, leaving behind only dampness and the smell of old metal. Alex Gray sat in front of the microphone, his fingers crusted with dried sweat as he clutched his earphones, his eyes red from lack of sleep as he stared at the console where a flickering screen counted down the last minutes of the broadcast. Outside, Grapefruit was shrouded in fog, its lights as dim as stars long gone, and the sound of the waves outside was like a breath too close to be the wind. Tonight, he would be on 96.8 FM one last time to call for Lili or whoever spoke with her voice. He played Lili's diary, her words echoing in his raspy voice. He said I wasn't needed anymore, but now I can hear them, calling me back. Alex stopped the recorder, his hand shaking like a leaf caught in a storm. He didn't know who he or they was, but he felt the answer was close, like a shadow creeping up behind him. Listeners flooded the chat with messages. "We hear her, Alex. She's on the frequency. Don't do this." He didn't read them, his gaze glued to the photo of Lili lying on the table, her bells glittering like eyes watching him. "Good night, Grapefruit," he began, his voice low as the roar of the sea, but with a crack in it, like glass ready to shatter. "This is Night Surf, and I'm your Alex Gray. We'll finish a story tonight. Lili Rain, are you there?" He turned the dial, and 96.8 FM crackled to life, like bones breaking in silence. The silence was thick, but then there was a rustle, faint as a whisper from underwater, and a voice, her voice, soft but tired, like a child carrying too much weight. "I'm here, Alex," Lili said, her words clear but distant, like a lighthouse. "In a storm." Alex gripped the microphone, his nails digging into his palms, but he felt no pain. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice a blow but also a plea. "Why are you calling? What do you want?" The silence answered him, but there was a ringing in it, bells thin as the threads that connected him to the past. "Tell Mom I miss blueberry pie," Lili said, her voice softening as if she were smiling, but there was a longing in that smile as old as the sea. Alex froze, his breath stopping as if someone had turned off the air. He remembered Evelyn's words. Lili baked a pie with her mother every Sunday, their laughter filling the house until it was empty. "Lili," he said, his voice shaking like a string about to snap. "Who is he? Who's coming?" She didn't answer right away, her breathing audible, light but uneven, like waves crashing against rocks. "He's forgotten me," she said finally, her words like ash falling to the ground. "Then I can go." The airwaves cut off, the radio went silent, its dial went blank, and a silence as heavy as lead filled the studio. Alex pressed the callback button, but the line was dead, like all the others. He ripped off the headphones, his hands shaking, as if he were trying to hold on to something that was already gone. He sat in the dark, his fingers stroking the photograph of Lili, her smile like a light that was gone. He didn't know if she was real, a ghost, an anomaly, someone's cruel game, but her words about the pie were like a knife in his heart. He thought of his daughter, her laughter, lost in the divorce, and he realized that Lili, whoever she was talking about him as well as herself. That he, too, had forgotten how to live. In the morning he drove to Evelyn's house, his car creaking like old bones, the rain drumming on the roof like fingers on glass. He found a cassette tape by the porch, its plastic wet, but the label read, Lili, 2004. It was a song she had sung in school, her voice clear as bells ringing in the wind. He left the tape by the door without knocking, his footsteps as quiet as a whisper as he walked away. He knew Evelyn would find it, and that she, like him, would listen, but find no answers. Alex left Grapefruit at dawn, his car disappearing into the fog like a ship sailing into nowhere. The radio was silent, its frequency 96.8 FM empty. But Lili's voice still rang in his head, her words an echo that would never fade. He had not found the truth, but he had learned that truth was not always salvation, and sometimes just a burden you carry until the end. The fog closed behind him, and Grapefruit was left behind, guarding its secrets as the sea guards its dead.